Between 1792 and 1800, more than 400 enslaved men, women, and children built what would become America's most recognizable landmark. But their names were deliberately erased from official records. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves across the Columbia Strip. For 2 centuries, the government maintained that these omissions were not accidents, they were policy. Then, in 1901, a restoration crew discovered something beneath the East Wing's foundation, prompting the superintendent to order an immediate halt to all excavation. Workers were ordered to keep absolutely silent. What they found was covered up within hours, but what remains suggests that the original construction was more than just a story of exploited labor. It points to a systematic cover-up of deaths that occurred in circumstances the fledgling young state would never dare admit. Tonight, you'll hear what those records really say. But before we continue the story of how America's greatest icon was built on pain that history deliberately hid, I want to ask you something. If you're listening from Washington, D.C., Virginia, Maryland, or anywhere in the United States, leave a comment telling us where you're from. These stories belong to all of us, and knowing where your audience is connecting makes this community even more connected. Subscribe to Liturgy of Fear so you don't miss the dark chapters of American history they try to bury. Let's uncover the truth together. The 1901 discovery wasn't the only time someone accidentally stumbled upon evidence of what really happened during those 8 years of construction. But to understand why those discoveries were so dangerous, you need to know how the project began and who was actually forced to do the labor. In 1790, Philadelphia was the nation's capital, but the Residence Act passed in July of that year established a new federal district along the Potomac River. President Washington himself picked the exact location in January 1791, a 10-mile square carved out of Maryland and Virginia. But it was nothing like the picturesque landscape we would later see. It was a malarial swamp infested with mosquitoes, uncomfortably hot in the summer, and dotted with small tobacco plantations where slaves had worked the land for generations. The commissioners appointed to oversee construction faced a problem from the start. The federal government had no money. The entire project, the president's house, the Capitol, the agency's the roads, was estimated to cost $400,000, a huge sum for a nation still deeply in debt from the Revolution. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson proposed a solution that was both simple and smart: hire slaves as laborers. The owners would receive a rental fee, usually $5 a month per person, while the enslaved workers would receive nothing but basic food and shelter. In a letter dated March 1792, Jefferson explained that this would keep costs under control and ensure the work proceeded without delays or complaints. The lead architect, James Hoban, an Irish immigrant who had designed many of Charleston's most famous buildings, submitted plans for the president's house in July 1792. His plans were heavily influenced by Leinster House in Dublin, with Georgian symmetry and ambitious scale. When Washington reviewed the plans, he requested that the building be expanded by 1/5 of its original size. This expansion would require more workers, more materials, and more time. The commissioners sent notices throughout Maryland and Virginia. Slave owners could lease their slaves to the federal construction project. Compensation was reliable, and the government promised to return the laborers intact. But that promise would be worthless. By November 1792, about 150 slaves had gathered at the construction site. They came from plantations across the region: Leon County, Charles County, Montgomery County, Prince George's County. Owners' names appear in the Commissioner's paybooks: Daniel Carroll, Notley, Young, Samuel Davidson, William Brent. But the workers themselves are only vaguely recorded. The books list names only, sometimes no names at all, simply Negro man or Negro boy with an approximate age: Tom, 23, Peter, 19, a boy named Harry, perhaps 14, a man named Len, who according to records was over 50 too old for such brutal work, but was hired because his master needed the monthly payment. Work began immediately, though winter was approaching. The first task was to clear the site, removing trees, draining the swamp, excavating the foundation. Imagine men and boys waist-deep in freezing mud, wielding nothing but shovels, pickaxes, and raw strength. The Commissioner's letters from that bitter first winter make only brief mention of difficulties with the Negro laborers caused by weather, but they never explain what those difficulties truly were. A note dated December 14th, 1792 refers to 3 workers who could not continue, but offers no explanation for why they left or what became of them. One worker who briefly left a trace in the records was a man named Isaac, hired from a plantation owner named Samuel Hanson. Isaac was a skilled carpenter, one of several enslaved craftsmen whose expertise was deemed essential. The Commissioner's correspondence shows Isaac working on interior carpentry throughout 1793 and 1794. While Hanson received payment for his labor through November 1794. Then suddenly, Isaac's name vanishes from the ledgers. No note of his return, no record of sale, no transfer. Simply gone, as though he had never existed at all. Another name frequently mentioned in the early records is Peter Lennox, a quarryman enslaved by Martha Custis, Peter's step-granddaughter of George Washington. Lennox supervised stone cutting at the government quarry in Acquia, Virginia, where the cream-colored sandstone for the president's house was extracted. Quarry work was among the most dangerous tasks imaginable. Massive blocks of stone had to be cut, lifted, and transported without modern machinery. One mistake, one slip, and a man could be crushed instantly. Lennox appears in payment records through 1796 praised as reliable and skilled. After that, he too disappears without explanation. The Commissioners, Thomas Johnson, Daniel Carroll, and David Stewart, rotated through various appointments, but their letters reveal a constant anxiety about the timeline. President Washington wanted the house finished before his term ended in 1797. That pressure became the enslaved workers' reality. Grueling schedules, letters, reference work from dawn until dark when the weather allowed double crews on foundation work to meet deadlines. 16-hour days, 7 days a week with no compensation beyond the barest food and shelter. Living conditions were equally harsh. Temporary wooden structures offered little protection from rain or cold. An expense record from March 1793 notes the purchase of straw for the Negro quarters, suggesting they slept on the ground. Another entry from August 1793 authorizes the purchase of salt fish and cornmeal, the cheapest provisions possible. No meat, no vegetables, just enough to keep them working. Disease followed swiftly. The swamplands spread malaria, typhoid, and dysentery. Commissioners' letters occasionally mention sickness among the workforce, always framed as an inconvenience to the construction schedule. A note from June 1793 complains that the flux has reduced available labor by nearly a third. The flux dysentery could kill in days. Yet, the letters speak only of delay, never of care or treatment. Medical care for enslaved workers was minimal. a physician, William Thornton, was hired to attend to them. But his records show far fewer visits to enslaved laborers than to free white workers, and he was paid less for their care. Often when an enslaved person grew too sick to work, the solution was simple: return them to their master and hire a replacement. What happened next? Recovery death sale was left undocumented. The Scottish stonemason Colin Williamson kept a raw, detailed diary. He supervised much of the stonework, and his entries, preserved until donated to the Library of Congress in 1968, offer glimpses into the daily reality. In April 1794, he wrote, "The Negro men work the stone despite bleeding hands. They are given no gloves, no proper tools, yet expected to match the quality of trained masons. Several have infections that should be tended." I mentioned this to the commissioner's representative, who said treatment would be provided when time allowed. Time, it seems, never allows. Williamson also recorded an incident in July 1794 absent from any official record. Today, a scaffold collapsed on the south wall. 3 men fell, 2 of them Negroes. The white man was carried to the physician immediately. The 2 Negroes lay where they fell for nearly an hour. One appears to have a broken back. I suspect he will not survive, and if he does, he will never walk again. This troubles me greatly, but I am told it is not my concern. The man with the suspected broken back was likely a worker named Ben, enslaved by William Brent. Ben's name appears in the ledgers through June 1794, then stops. Brent continued to receive payment for Negro labor in July and August 1794, but the name changes to Negro Man Jim. This pattern, sudden name substitutions in payment records, occurs repeatedly, suggesting workers were replaced while the circumstances of their departure were deliberately erased. By 1795, the shell of the structure was largely complete, but interior work would take several more years. And behind every ledger entry, behind every missing name, lies a story of suffering of lives overlooked and erased. Have you ever wondered what it truly felt like to work there day after day, in silence under the weight of history itself? The project soon expanded, no longer limited to the president's house alone. The surrounding landscape, the roads, ancillary buildings, all became part of the endeavor. And with expansion came a growing workforce. By 1798, between 400 and 500 people labored across the site at quarries, brick kilns, and lumber mills. The majority, of course, were enslaved. The commissioner's papers from this period grow increasingly vague about the enslaved workforce. Where earlier letters had categorized them: Negro carpenters, Negro laborers, Negro quarrymen. Later references blur into generic terms: workers hired from area plantations, contracted labor servants. This linguistic shift was no accident. As the project gained prominence, as the nation's eyes turned toward the president's house, the commissioners became careful, perhaps too careful, about recording who was truly doing the labor. They understood even then that the optics were troubling. The house of the president, the symbol of the young republic, was being built by people who had no freedom within it. George Washington himself visited the construction site multiple times throughout the 1790s. His diary entries speak only of architectural progress and deadlines. Not once do they mention the enslaved workers who formed at least 70% of the workforce. This omission speaks volumes. The founders chose what to see and what to ignore. White laborers on site, mostly immigrants from Ireland and Scotland, were paid wages $1 per day for skilled craftsmen, 50 cents for ordinary laborers. They could leave, they could complain, They had names in the records. Families noted places of origin recorded. When injured, they received care. When they died, graves were marked and families notified. None of this applied to the enslaved workers. No choice, no voice, no recourse. They built the house stone by stone, brick by brick, knowing they would never walk through its doors as anything but servants. They knew their children would inherit their chains, their names erased, while the names of architects, commissioners, and presidents were carved into history. Yet some of them left marks anyway. Small, deliberate acts of presence hidden in plain sight, waiting to be discovered centuries later. In the spring of 1796, James Hoban reported a curious problem to the commissioners. Several stone blocks in the north wall bore strange markings. Shallow scratches, deliberate rather than accidental. Hoban's letter, dated April 3, 1796, described them as crude symbols or letters. Purpose unknown. He asked whether the stones should be replaced or turned inward. The commissioners replied on April 10th, turn them inward and continue. Likely meaningless scratches from handling. No need to delay work for such trivialities, they wrote. But the markings were not trivial. They were names. Enslaved workers with stone-cutting skills had carved initials or even full names like Isaac into the stones they shaped. The carvings were subtle, easily dismissed unless you knew what to look for. Extraordinary courage. Discovery during carving would have meant severe punishment. Yet, they did it anyway. These men whose names appeared in ledgers only as Tom Peter or Negro Man carved their presence into the house itself. We were here. We built this. Remember us. Hoban never reported finding additional marked stones, perhaps because he stopped noticing or because he stopped reporting. The commissioner's dismissive response suggests the latter. Why bother officials with what they had already deemed irrelevant? The marked stones were rediscovered only in 1902 during Theodore Roosevelt's renovation. Workers removing plaster from interior walls found the stones exactly as Hoban had instructed, turned inward. Charles McKim, the renovation supervisor, noted in his private records, found various stones with crude markings on interior faces. Some appear to be initials or names, likely made by workers during original construction. No official report was filed, and the stones remained hidden behind new plaster. But the carved stones were only a small part of what had been deliberately concealed. The more significant hiding began in the summer of 1797, following an incident that could have destroyed the project's fragile reputation. July brought one of the worst heat waves anyone could remember. Temperatures climbed above 100 degrees for days, relentless and unforgiving. The combination of blistering heat, the oppressive humidity of the swamplands and scarce water created catastrophic conditions for the workers. Within 2 weeks, dozens of enslaved laborers fell ill with what the commissioner's letters vaguely describe as summer fevers. Urgent correspondence poured from the commissioners to plantation owners. Your workers have taken sick and cannot continue. Send replacements. At least 23 of these letters survive, all demanding immediate replacements, hinting that the true number of sick workers was far higher. What happened to those who fell ill? The commissioner's papers offer no follow-up. Plantation owners' replies, where they survive, merely acknowledge receipt and confirm replacement workers were sent. No mention of the fate of the sick, no note of recovery, no acknowledgement of death. Silence. Colin Williamson's diary from this time is haunting. The sickness spread through the Negro quarters like wildfire. On July 23, 1797, he wrote, "I have seen at least a dozen men too weak to stand. Yet, there is no physician attending them. They lie in those wretched barracks burning with fever, and no one seems concerned except to determine when replacement workers will arrive. I asked the commissioner's man what provisions have been made for treatment. He told me the sick ones have been moved to an isolated area to prevent contagion from spreading. When I asked where he became evasive, saying it was not my affair. 5 days later, Williamson's entry grows darker. I have learned where the sick are kept. A hastily constructed shed near the old kiln site, a quarter mile from the main construction. I walked there this morning, despite instructions to stay in my area. At least 20 men lie there with almost no care. One young woman, perhaps 16, tends them with nothing but water and rags. The heat is unbearable. Many of the men are clearly dying. I confronted the overseer. I was told the commissioners cannot halt construction for illness. The sick will recover or they will not. My task is stonework, not nursing. I feel ashamed to be part of this enterprise. The girl he mentioned appears nowhere in the official records. Enslaved women were present on the project, mostly as cooks and laundresses. Yet documentation is scant. Perhaps she was brought specifically to care for the sick, temporarily hired for her skills, then returned to her master when the crisis ended or did not. Williamson's final entry on this period, dated August 5th, 1797, is chilling in its brevity. The shed is empty. He asked what had become of the men. He was told they had recovered and been sent back to their plantations. Yet he saw no wagons, no men walking or being helped away. The shed was simply empty and no one would speak of it. Williamson suspected something terrible but had no proof. No one to whom he could speak and no one who would care. What happened to these sick workers? If they truly recovered and were returned, there should be records, letters from plantation owners, complaints about their weakened condition. Instead, there is silence. One surviving letter offers a troubling hint. Samuel Hansen, who had hired Isaac the carpenter, wrote to the commissioners in September 1797 he had received payment for labor through July, but his 3 enslaved workers, sent in June, had not been returned. The commissioners replied vaguely, "The workers to which you refer were afflicted with summer illness and could not continue. Arrangements were made for their care. We will inquire into their present situation and inform you accordingly." No follow-up letter survives. Some plantation owners like William Brent pressed further. In November 1797, he demanded the return of 5 enslaved workers who had not returned, despite replacement workers having been sent months earlier. The commissioner's reply came within 3 days, unusually fast, but cold and businesslike. The workers to which you refer met with unfortunate circumstances during their service. Death occurred despite best efforts at treatment. Payment to you for their labor will cease as of November 1st. No additional compensation can be provided. At least 5 workers had died. No details were given how they died, where they were buried, whether their families were notified. Their deaths were treated as an unfortunate but unremarkable business matter. How many others perished quietly without anyone ever asking? Benjamin Latrobe Jr., an architectural historian, estimated in an 1882 private letter that between 30 and 50 enslaved people likely died during the President's House construction. He based this on gaps in the payment ledgers, sudden name substitutions, and unusually high requests for replacement workers, particularly during the brutal summer of 1797. Yet even his estimate might be conservative. Considering mortality rates on other large construction projects of the era, the true death toll could have reached 40, perhaps 75 among the 400 to 500 enslaved workers who cycled through the project. Where were they buried? This question leads directly to the discovery made in 1901, a discovery so shocking that it caused an immediate halt to excavation and sworn secrecy among the workers. What lay beneath the foundations that had been built with so much suffering? The answer remained hidden, waiting to be uncovered decades later. In 1901, during a restoration project to reinforce the East Wing's foundation, workers dug down to expose the original stones laid in 1792. About 6 feet beneath the current ground level, they uncovered human bones, at least a dozen skulls, according to the superintendent's private notes, mixed with countless other bones hastily buried without ceremony. No coffins, no markers, just human remains hidden beneath the foundation. The superintendent, Henry Reed, understood immediately the implications. News of human remains buried beneath the White House would have caused scandal investigations, questions the government might never have wanted to answer. That afternoon, Reed made a decision. The bones would be reburied exactly where they had been found. No one outside the work crew would be told. Renovation would continue elsewhere. Reed kept a personal diary, later donated to the National Archives in 1978. His entry from October 12, 1901, recounts the discovery in haunting detail. We found them approximately 6 feet down, just outside the original eastern foundation line. The bones were mixed together, no proper burial discernible. Some skulls showed damage consistent with trauma, though I am no medical expert. At least 12 skulls, perhaps more, some fragmentary. The Negro workers on our crew became very quiet when we uncovered them. One old man, Joseph, said he had heard stories from his grandfather about workers buried near the house during original construction. He called them the Forgotten Ones. By day's end, everything had been reburied. Reed instructed all workers that nothing had been found, and anyone speaking of the discovery would be dismissed immediately. The work moved to the western side of the foundation. He never filed an official report. He never told the president's staff, never informed the Department of the Interior. He took the secret to his grave in 1924. The discovery raised terrible questions. Were these some of the enslaved workers who disappeared during the deadly summer of 1797? Were there more unmarked graves elsewhere on the grounds? The bones, some showing trauma, could have come from construction accidents, brutal labor, or even violence. Reed never allowed proper forensic examination. The truth, it seemed, would remain forever unknown. By the time John Adams moved into the president's house in November 1800, most of the enslaved workers had been returned to plantations scattered across Maryland and Virginia. Their labor, their suffering was already written out of the official narrative. The final commissioner's report submitted in December 1800 details every architectural feature, every cost, every challenge overcome. It praises James Hoburn's design and George Washington's vision. It thanks skilled craftsmen. Yet never once does it acknowledge that the majority of those craftsmen were enslaved people. Unpaid, unrecognized, sometimes buried without ceremony. Thomas Jefferson moved in after his inauguration in March 1801. bringing his own enslaved workers from Monticello cooks, servants, laborers. For Jefferson, enslaved people within the house were simply the way things were. He wrote eloquently about liberty while surrounded by people who had none, never seeming to notice the profound contradiction. The building would come to be known as the White House decades later, though the origin of the name is disputed. Some say it referred to the white paint applied after the British burned the building in 1814. Others claim it referred to the pale sandstone's natural color. Regardless, the name stuck, and with it came a sanitized mythology about the construction almost entirely false. Official histories of the White House written throughout the 19th century barely mentioned the enslaved workforce. When they did, it was with euphemistic language: servants, workers from local plantations, contracted labor. The reality that these people had no choice, received no pay, risked their lives, and in some cases were buried on site was erased. Even guides acknowledging slavery minimized it. An 1831 guidebook described the building as erected by skilled craftsmen and laborers, brought together through the federal commissioner's diligent efforts. True technically, but brought together suggested voluntary collaboration, not coerced labor. Yet, the truth survived within the enslaved community, passed down through generations. Stories of heat sickness, friends who vanished, bones buried beneath the grounds, marked stones hidden in the walls. These accounts persisted, quietly whispered from elder to child. One such story was preserved in 1978 among papers donated to Howard University. A woman named Celia Robertson, born into slavery in 1819, recorded the stories her grandfather Thomas had told her in the 1840s. He had worked on the president's house in the 1790s. Thomas' recollections paint a far darker picture than any official history. He said they worked until their hands bled. Their backs could not straighten. Overseers did not see them as men, but as tools. When a tool broke, you got another. When a man fell, you got another man. They buried friends in the night, unseen said prayers that no one wrote down. Thomas spoke of a friend Peter who carved his name in stone and told him, "They'll forget us, but the stone will remember long after we're gone. Our names will be in those walls, even if nobody can see them." Peter never came home. One summer he fell ill and was taken away, never seen again. Celia's account also preserves Thomas's trauma nightmares for the rest of his life. Shaking awake, hearing men dying in the shed where the sick were kept. He tried to bring them water, but overseers would not allow it. The sounds, he said, were cries for mothers, for wives, for mercy, then silence. Thomas also described the scaffolding collapse that killed multiple workers, confirming Colin Williamson's diary entry. 3 men fell, 1 white and 2 colored. The white man was carried away, immediately tended to without delay. But the 2 colored men lay, broken on the ground, for nearly an hour before anyone even looked at them. One screamed as his leg twisted unnaturally. The other did not move at all. Eventually, they were both carried to the shed. Thomas never saw either of them again. Celia Robertson's account, preserved decades later, would not be known publicly until its discovery among Howard University's archives and mention in an obscure academic journal in 1982. Even then, the story received little attention. The mainstream historical community largely ignored it, perhaps because it contradicted the more comfortable narrative about the building's origins. one that had been carefully constructed over nearly 2 centuries. Yet, the document raised urgent, haunting questions. If Thomas's memories were accurate and there is no reason to think his granddaughter invented them, then the official record had deliberately obscured countless deaths, hidden the terrible conditions endured by the enslaved workers. The shed where the sick were kept matched Colin Williamson's diary almost exactly. The scaffolding incident he described also matched. Across decades, their stories converged, confirming one another. This convergence of evidence suggested what historians had long suspected, but could never prove: the construction of the president's house involved the deaths of enslaved people, and those deaths were systematically erased from history. Physical evidence reinforced this truth. In 1978, the same year Robertson's account surfaced, archaeologists conducted a survey of the White House grounds, employing ground-penetrating radar in areas untouched since the 1790s. The survey revealed anomalies consistent with unmarked graves in at least 3 locations. One lay near where Henry Reed's crew had uncovered bones in 1901. Another near the old kiln mentioned by Williamson. The third within what is now the Rose Garden. The archaeologists documented these findings but recommended against excavation. They understood the political implications of unearthing human remains on the White House grounds, especially those of enslaved people buried without ceremony or record. "We know they are here," the report stated, "but digging them up would be complicated. Let them remain undisturbed." The choice mirrored the decisions made in 1797 and 1901. In both cases, the preservation of institutional reputation took precedence over truth, over memory, over human dignity. The people buried in those unmarked graves had been forgotten in death, just as they had been exploited in life. Even when evidence surfaced, the instinct was to bury it, literally or figuratively. Benjamin Latrobe Jr., an architectural historian, became obsessed with uncovering the true toll. In the 1880s, he combed surviving commissioner papers and sought oral histories from elderly African Americans whose grandparents had worked on the president's house. He recorded accounts from 17 individuals. Their stories were strikingly consistent. Brutal labor-meager food and water-endemic disease friends, disappearing from the workforce and never returning. Several remembered the summer of 1797 as particularly deadly. One man told Latrobe, "My grandmother said her uncle went to work on the president's building and caught the fever that summer. They took him to a place away from the others. Her mother searched for him but could not find him. Later, they told her he had died and been buried but would not say where. She searched for years and never found his grave." Latrobe compiled these stories into a manuscript he titled "The Hidden Cost Enslaved Labor in the Construction of Federal Buildings." He tried for 5 years to publish it. Every publisher refused. Too controversial, too challenging to the accepted narrative, too damaging to the reputation of venerable institutions. Latrobe died in 1887, bitter, frustrated, the truth still unacknowledged. His manuscript remained unpublished until 1934, released by a small academic press in a print run of just 500 copies. It sold poorly and quickly disappeared. Only about 24 copies survive today, scattered in libraries and private collections. Even when documented, the truth could not overcome the myth. The White House had become a symbol of democracy, of American ideals. Acknowledging that it had been built by enslaved hands, some of whom died unmarked and forgotten, challenged that symbol. It demanded a confrontation with the nation's founding that many were unwilling to face. So the story remained buried, hidden beneath decades, even centuries of silence. When John Adams moved in as the first president in November 1800, the president's house was complete. By then, most of the enslaved workers who had built it had been returned to plantations across Maryland and Virginia. Their labor, their suffering, their very lives had been expunged from the official history, remembered only in whispers, shadows, and the occasional carved stone hidden in the walls. Their role in creating the building had already been erased from the official narrative. The Commissioner's final report, submitted in December 1800, is a masterpiece of omission. It detailed every architectural feature, every cost, every challenge overcome. It praised James Hobun's design and George Washington's vision. It thanked the skilled craftsmen who brought the building to life. But it never once mentioned that the majority of those craftsmen were enslaved people who received no payment, no recognition, and in some cases, no proper burial. When Thomas Jefferson moved in March 1801, he brought his own enslaved workers from Monticello cooks, servants, laborers, to maintain the grounds. To Jefferson, their presence was neither ironic nor contradictory. It was simply the way things were. He wrote eloquently about liberty while surrounded by people who had none, never seeming to grasp the profound dissonance. Among the enslaved community, the story of the building's construction survived through whispered conversations, quiet warnings, and the careful passing of memories. Elderly people who had worked on the project told their children what it had really been like: the heat, the sickness, friends who disappeared and never returned. They spoke of bones buried somewhere on the grounds, stones hidden in walls, names no one would remember. One story survived in a remarkable way. In 1843, a woman named Celia Robertson, born into slavery in 1819, began secretly writing down her grandfather Thomas's recollections of working on the president's house in the 1790s. She kept these writings hidden, knowing that possession of such materials could be punishable. Her account, passed down privately through her family, remained unknown to historians for generations. Thomas's stories, filtered through his granddaughter's careful memory, painted a picture far darker than any official history. He said they worked until their hands bled and their backs could no longer straighten. White overseers saw them not as men, but as tools like hammers and saws. When a tool broke, you got another. When a man fell, you got another man. They buried friends in the night when no one was watching, said prayers over them that no one wrote down. He told of his friend Peter, who carved his name in a stone and told Thomas, "They'll forget us, but the stone will remember. Long after we're gone, our names will be in these walls even if nobody can see them." Grandfather cried when he recounted this. Peter never came home. One summer, he fell ill, was taken away, and was never seen again. Thomas also described the shed near the kiln where sick workers were isolated during that terrible summer of 1797. He tried to bring water to help them, but the overseers would not allow it. He could hear them calling for their mothers, for their wives, for mercy. After a few days, the shed was empty. Nobody ever said what became of the men. Thomas carried nightmares from that summer for the rest of his life. These accounts, horrifying as they are, were corroborated by other sources Williamson's diary superintendent, Henry Reeds, notes even archaeological evidence decades later. Stories of bones reburied beneath the White House stones, marked with initials and names quietly carved into walls, all point to a history deliberately hidden. Even when evidence surfaced, it was suppressed. In 1867, workers repairing foundation damage found a small wooden disc about 2 inches across, carved with the initials PL on one side and the date 1796 on the other. Likely Peter Lennox, a forgotten worker. The disc was logged, then shelved. No one investigated further. That same year, workers uncovered bones near the eastern wall, Old Skulls, human remains. They were quietly reburied. Questions were unasked. In 1891, historian Herbert Braftoft was commissioned to document federal buildings. Among previously unseen archives, he discovered correspondence between commissioners and plantation owners. William Brent had reported 5 of his workers dead. Samuel Davidson, in an unsent letter to his brother, described 3 more deaths blaming barbaric conditions and cruel overseers. Davidson wrote, "The true toll is far higher than anyone will admit." Braftoft compiled these findings in a manuscript section titled "The Human Cost of Construction." He wrote carefully, honestly revealing what the records showed: enslaved men and women, laboring in brutal conditions, falling ill, dying, and disappearing, while the official history erased them entirely. The construction of the President's House, that grand symbol of American democracy, was achieved in large part through the forced labor of enslaved people. The conditions they endured were brutal. The pay they received was nothing. And the deaths were quietly erased. Evidence suggests at least 40 individuals perished, and perhaps many more. Yet official records deliberately obscure their fates. These deaths were omitted from every history of the building that followed. In 1892, historian Herbert Bancroft submitted a draft manuscript to the Interior Department. His research was meticulous, and he did not shy away from uncomfortable truths. He documented the deaths, the letters from plantation owners demanding answers, the suffering endured. The response came swiftly. "Remove this section," the department instructed. "This history is to celebrate architectural achievement. Do not dwell on unfortunate incidents." Bancroft protested, arguing that a true history must include the reality of suffering, that to omit it dishonored those who died. But the reply was unequivocal: remove the section or no payment, no publication. Bancroft spent 2 years on the project. He had a family. He removed the section, but he did not destroy it. He kept the pages in a folder with copies of the most damning letters he had uncovered. On the folder he wrote, "The truth about how the President's House was built, removed from my history at government insistence. May someone braver than I eventually tell this story." H.P. April, 1892. The published history of 1893 contained exactly 1 paragraph about enslaved labor. Workers from local plantations contributed skills to the construction. The reality that men and women had labored without choice, without pay, some dying in the process, was gone. Decades later, in October 1901, the buried truths returned. During restoration work on the East Wing Foundation, crews dug down to the original stones, laid in 1792. Around 6 feet below the present surface, a shovel struck something that was not stone or soil. Bones. Human bones. A skull. Then another. Then more. At least a dozen skulls scattered among other bones, haphazardly buried with no coffins, no markers, no ceremony. Superintendent Henry Reed arrived quickly. He understood immediately what he had found and what it meant. If word reached, the public investigations would follow. The history of suffering so carefully erased would be exposed. Reed made his decision within the hour the crew would rebury everything exactly where it had been found. They would say nothing. The work would continue elsewhere, and anyone speaking of the discovery would face immediate dismissal. The older black laborers on the crew fell silent. One man, Joseph, who had worked the White House grounds for 40 years, approached Reed quietly. He spoke of the stories his father had told him of men buried near the house workers who had died and been quietly hidden. They called them the forgotten ones, Joseph said. His voice trembled. There was a bad summer. So many got sick. They took them away to a shed. After that, you never heard of them again. Reed nodded slowly. Thank you for telling me this, Joseph. But what we found today, it doesn't leave this site. Do you understand? Joseph nodded. Yes, sir. Reed turned back to the work. In that moment, those men were buried twice, once in the soil and again in silence, their stories unspoken, their existence denied. And still the stones and the bones remained silent witnesses to a truth that few were willing to see. That evening, Henry Reed sat in his room at a boarding house near the White House. He wrote quietly in his personal diary, "We found them today. At least 12 skulls, possibly more, buried just outside the original Eastern Foundation. No coffins, no markers, no dignity. Some skulls show damage that might be from trauma, though I am no expert." Joseph, one of our workers, said his grandfather told stories about workers buried near the house during construction. He called them the Forgotten Ones, an apt name. Reed paused in his writing. The bones had been reburied that afternoon. The crew was warned that any mention of the discovery would result in immediate dismissal. The foundation work was moved west, and the secret remained with him alone. For the rest of his life, Reed never filed a report. He never told the president's staff or the Interior Department. He carried the secret to his grave, and only his diary preserved the record of what had been found. The men whose bones lay beneath the White House remained nameless. Some had carved their names into the stones that built the walls, small acts of remembrance hidden behind plaster. Others may have been listed on a ledger or forgotten entirely. Reed could not stop thinking about the shed where sick workers had been taken that terrible summer. He thought about the trauma visible in some of the skulls, and he thought about the pattern that stretched across more than a century. Someone in 1797 decided these deaths were unworthy of record. Someone in 1867 decided that bones discovered should be quietly reburied. And now Reed himself had made the same choice. In March 1902, during renovations, workmen discovered more evidence of those forgotten lives. Behind plaster, they found shallow scratches on stones' names and initials carved deliberately by the people who had shaped them. T on one stone, PL on another, and Isaac on a third. Timothy O'Brien, a young worker, sketched the names before the plaster was replaced. They were likely enslaved men who had built the house, leaving marks so that even in invisibility, they might be remembered. But the supervisor ordered the plaster replaced, and the discovery kept silent. By the summer of 1902, renovations were complete. The White House gleamed. Visitors admired the building. Tour guides spoke of presidents and architecture. No one mentioned the bones buried beneath the foundations. No one spoke of the names hidden in the walls. And the painful human cost of the construction remained absent from the history being taught. In African American communities around Washington, some elders still whispered stories. My people built, that they would say. Some of them died building it and were buried right there on the grounds. But those stories were fading generations removed, and the official history ignored them. The bones stayed buried. The carved names stayed hidden. The scattered documents and diaries remained unread in boxes and archives. And the mythology endured. The White House, built by skilled craftsmen under normal circumstances, stood untouched, shining in the sun, while the truth slept quietly beneath its foundations. The stories were true, but they survived only in whispers in oral tradition among the descendants of the enslaved. Written history told a different, cleaner tale. This is how truth dies, not in one dramatic act, but in 1,000 small decisions to look away, to stay silent, to prioritize comfort over honesty. Herbert Bancroft removed his section rather than lose his payment. Henry Reed reburied the bones rather than create scandal. Renovation supervisors ordered the plaster replaced over carved names rather than acknowledge their significance. Each decision seemed reasonable in isolation. Each person had understandable reasons, but the accumulation of all those reasonable decisions meant that the people who had built the White House with their own hands, who had died in the process, who had carved their names into stone, hoping to be remembered, those people were forgotten anyway. The White House still stands more than a century after those bones were found and reburied. It stands on foundations laid by labor that was never compensated, never acknowledged, never honored. And for generations after 1902, the comfortable mythology persisted because the truth had been buried too many times, too deeply, by too many people who chose not to see it. This story shows how historical truth can be methodically erased through seemingly reasonable decisions. How institutional silence can be more powerful than active censorship. How people can build the most famous symbols while remaining utterly invisible themselves. The cost of maintaining these myths is often paid by those who have no voice to protest, no power to demand remembrance, no way to make history acknowledge that they existed. What do you think happened to the workers whose names disappeared from the records? How many do you think really died? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if this story has haunted you, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, hit the notification bell, and share this with someone who needs to hear these forgotten voices. See you in the next story.